Thank you for joining the Workforce 2020 webinar today with CIPS and Hays Talent Solutions. My name is Helen Alder. I'm Head of Knowledge and Product Development for CIPS. In my position, I have the pleasure of working with Hays, not only in the area of career development and producing the salary survey, but also in the area of recruitment outsourcing. Presenting this webinar today, we have two members from Hays Talent Solutions, Jonathan Mannell, Global Innovation Director, and Jeff Fawcett, Director. John has joined and worked for RPO and MSP sector for over 10 years with a range of financial services, public sector, IT and telecommunications and infrastructure clients. He is now responsible for ensuring that the products and services offered continue to meet the changing needs of the global market. Jeff Fawcett has been in the recruitment industry for over 2 decades and has witnessed the changing role of procurement as it moves from the back-end function to a strategic linchpin. On today's webinar, John and Jeff will outline how procurement professionals can step up to help address the biggest challenges facing today's organisation, access to talent, and in turn raise the profile of procurement. They will discuss the current risks and challenges associated with workforce spend, how strategic procurement methods can be applied, and the benefits of applying supply management expertise to workforce management. Towards the end of the presentation, if you could send in your questions via the Q&A box on the bottom right, we will pick them up at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I will now pass you over to John.
Great, thank you, Helen, and good morning, everyone. So when we start to consider the subject matter around strategic procurement with regards to total workforce costs, there's one question that always gets raised, and it starts with a review around whether or not organisations have got a view on their non-permanent workforce. We've seen a number of great procurement professionals go on to big roles in well-known companies. It's unfortunately been no secret that on occasion procurement has sometimes struggled to gain its seat at the table. We're strong believers that procurement holds the key to addressing organisations' biggest challenges, that of access to talent. And there are a number of different trends that we see impacting their use of non-permanent workforce, and this in turn impacts the overall cost of engaging that workforce. Skills gaps are fast becoming a skills chasm. We're seeing a proliferation of suppliers and different sources of hire, and indeed a variety of different kinds of work creeping into the workforce, not just around kind of temp work, but things like freelancers and services engagement to supply workforce demands to the business itself. How businesses are accessing talent is increasingly creeping up the board agenda, and we believe procurement professionals are in a prime position to take control and to apply their strategic expertise to this broader category, raising the profile of the function as a result by supporting key stakeholders in addressing some of their most pressing concerns. I've worked in this part of the sector for the last 16 years, looking at different forms of workforce engagement models, and my observation over that time is that procurement has done a great job of working with the business over many number of years to introduce controls around a number of different areas of workforce with workforce engagement models. One of the things that's been common though is that these models tend to be focused into discrete areas of spend, usually categorised by their resource type, as you can see on the spectrum here, with things like talent acquisition or outsourced RPO services focused into permanent and FTC hiring, with managed services looking at temp and contract hiring, and at the other end of the spectrum applying real strategic procurement expertise to engaging services, to consulting, and also to procurement around capital projects. What we've also seen though is that there are areas of spend which are still relatively uncontrolled, those that sit within the middle of the spectrum itself, relating to staff augmentation or to a lot of T&M kind of SOW engagement. And as a result, with controls sitting at both ends of the spectrum, we've seen a number of unwanted behaviours creep into many organisations, whether that's been to avoid headcount restrictions or for hiring managers or business units to retain some control when they're accessing skills. and hiring managers are increasingly turning to the uncontrolled areas of this spectrum to meet their needs. What we've seen is that this leads not only to rogue spend that's not tracked, but also to an inflated cost of engaging a workforce with an increased risk profile, as there's a lack of consistency around how workers are engaged outside of the historic areas of control. One simple example here, which many of you will recognise, is that we increasingly see businesses or individuals engaging for freelancers or consulting services on corporate credit cards or purchasing cards, and engaging workers outside the controls that we've all placed into organisations to control cost and control risk. Historically an undesirable area of spend, but with things like GDPR regulations coming into force next year, we also know that that will mean you're exposing yourself to more risk, because the controls put in place to ensure that suppliers meet the terms of the regulations around things like data protection and security are unlikely to be enforced. And those challenges are becoming kind of ever more present within organisations around the world. My role focuses primarily on consulting with businesses around their workforce engagement models. And if you talk to businesses and also look at publicly available stats, it's quite clear that the gig economy itself is impacting a rise in the use of contingent workers everywhere around the globe. A view from the staffing industry analysts that half of the British workforce will be self-employed freelancers by 2020 is perhaps at the upper end of the spectrum, but we do recognise that at least 15% of workers in the UK at this point in time are engaged in a form of non-permanent employment. And as a result, what we're seeing is a proliferation of people being engaged through areas that have historically had very low levels of business control, and are therefore being engaged at higher cost and with higher risk profiles than most organisations would ideally like to see. Before we move on to look at some of the strategic procurement tools that we see in the marketplace and that we're consulting with businesses to implement, I'm going to pass over to Jeff to just give us a view on how business is reacting to some of these trends.
Thanks, John. So what are we seeing here? Well, one way of addressing this ever-increasing use of this ever-changing workforce is the increasing use of temp or non-perm workers. Deloitte's recent Human Capital Trends 2016 report surveyed over 7,000 execs and found that 42% plan to increase or significantly increase the use of contingent workers over the next 3 to 5 years. And indeed, only 16% of executives expect to decrease the size of their contingent workforce. I think there's always a view that most organisations think they can reduce their temp or non-perm workforce, and the reality is it often doesn't happen. So let's talk about compliance. There's a major danger here of the employers and businesses misclassifying millions of workers out there. This is hugely worrying, as mismanaging your contingent workforce can lead to issues such as co-employment and reclassification. Over the last few years, we've seen a number of very big names go through huge resulting class action lawsuits and fines that could have very easily been avoided. According to staffing industry analysts, the MSP Market Development Report in 2016, minimising risk of non-compliance is one of the top 6 drivers for using an MSP. And for us, this is probably the main reason we see people coming to use our services, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Organisations with modern workforce management systems can automate processes such as employee pay and time conditions to eliminate errors, enforce policies and reduce these risks. Automated rules, alerts and a complete audit trail ensure time work is tracked, that workers are appropriately certified, and that all applicable laws and regulations have been adhered to. I think risk is becoming more important than cost, and that's something we're typically hearing from our customers. Increasing use of non-permanent workers is driving the risk agenda across the board. As the employment law requirements around this vital workforce change constantly, procurement teams are putting in increased risk controls to protect the organisations who use them. We've seen financial services and banking leading the charge when looking at this tightening procedure, and this trend is replicated in oil and gas and the public sector, amongst others. We're seeing additional layers of pre-employment screening being deployed, regardless of vendor commitments to delivering the compliant resources, to assure regulators of compliance where resources have access to client data and client organisations using centralised compliance teams covering multiple regions as a means of driving consistent risk controls. When multicultural delivery forms part of a non-permanent workforce programme, delivery comes with a big focus on correct worker classification due to just different legislative landscapes by country. Two workers doing the same job in two different countries could very likely have very different classifications. Our work with multi-country customers highlights the need to engage the local labour market specialists like Hayes in order to navigate the employment law successfully to avoid unnecessary risk exposure in the way you engage your contingent labour. One thing is very clear, there are always challenges in managing those risks. One of the biggest can be getting worker buy-in to complete all the paperwork, but your MSP can ensure they are engaged throughout the process. Regional variations in processes often present challenges when trying to implement a common standard, but an MSP will be able to bring consistency across your workforce as part of a vendor-neutral programme, taking local legislative variances into account.
Thanks, Jeff. So we just take a step kind of back up out and look at the landscape that we're dealing with at the moment and look at the impact of some of the labour market trends or the workforce trends, the risks that we're all facing, and the fact that under our historic constructs and procurement models, we have had a very siloed, category-specific focus into engaging with workforce. The consequences of that have been very clear, and I'm sure a number of you on the call would have seen as controls have gone in around one part of the workforce, for example, temps and contractors. You've seen an unwanted behaviour of workers themselves then being transferred into other forms of engagement at higher costs with higher risk profiles, moving up into more staff augmentation or even time and materials SOW engagements. Similarly, as we've seen controls going at the top end of the spectrum, we've seen again workers kind of pushing down and workforce engagement being pushed down into smaller packages of work that go under financial limits and controls that we've set around spend that must come through central procurement teams. And the consequence of this ultimately is that by taking a siloed view around engaging with resources and not a holistic one, we are creating the conditions that create an increase in the total cost of ownership of workforce that we're looking to engage and radically increase the risk profile that we're exposed to as organisations. So, what are we seeing? Pick up on Jeff's earlier point, this isn't just about looking at the services that an outsourced provider can supply in the form of a managed service programme and extending that up the spectrum out of its contingent workforce's legacy focus into areas of time and materials or services procurement spend. It's also about taking organisations on a journey around engaging with total talent management as a concept. Now, this is something which is not new, been around for a number of years, but what we've really seen in the last, I'd say 12 to 18 months, is a marked increase in the number of organisations who've been exploring the concept of total talent management and actually actively pursuing what total talent management can deliver to them as an organisation. And there are a number of key learns, I guess, in here which we want to pass back to you through this webinar. One of the most fundamental reasons why total talent management initiatives fail within organisations are some of the pre-existing organisational constraints that we see impacting the way resources are onboarded. So, for example, historically, perm and FTC, temp and contract hires will tend to form under a headcount category because they are under the direction and control of the organisation, whereas most forms of services outsourcing or time and materials engagement are assumed to be under the direction and control of the organisation itself. An inability to be able to add resources to headcount for a variety of reasons around FTE or headcount restrictions drives an organisation to engage in non-FTE or non-headcounted means. But organisations taking this approach to total talent management or approaching this as more of a headcount neutral engagement, they're taking the concept of FTE and budget and headcount off the table because they've seen that this is something driving an increase in the total cost of ownership within their own organisations. I'm working currently with a couple of firms in financial services in the UK who've spent the last 12 to 18 months tackling the question of headcount as a primary concern, and only once that issue has been resolved have they then embarked on total talent management as a journey. And the reason why we can't talk about total talent management, which historically, right, has been a very talent acquisition or HR-led principle, is that colleagues in HR and talent acquisition need the strategic focus and the procurement controls that this profession brings in order to bring total talent management to reality. And so where we see total talent management succeeding, it's where we have a very strong partnership established between procurement and HR to enable a more strategic focus on engaging talent in a variety of different forms. And as we say, when you look at engaging with perm or fixed-term contract hires or even the contingent workforce, HR is so well placed to lead the conversation with the C-suite because these are readily recognised as forms of talent which are engaged in a controlled manner and in a way that is legislatively compliant. When you extend the scope of these services into total talent management, you need to start to look to introduce procurement controls across the resources managed under the direction and control of the service providers, eradicating the gaps and issues that arise from uncontrolled spend in the tactical space with time and materials or staff augmentation vendors. And this requires HR to partner with procurement to establish best practice procurement practices and to ensure that only the best suppliers are engaged based on criteria that are objectively reviewed and that those controls are applied consistently at all levels for all resource types right across the organisation itself. But it's not just about putting procurement controls in place. There are also a variety of other factors, predominantly technology focused, that we need to take into account because engaging with Workforce 2020, and that being the workforce of the future, is going to require us to introduce new forms of technology into our delivery ecosystem. The rise in freelancers across the world is creating a range of new marketplaces where talent and freelancers themselves congregate, where organisations can engage freelancers for pieces of work, not always traditionally large, high-value, long-term outsourced projects, but in a sense, slivers of work, which may be creating a brief around an employee value proposition or creating a presentation content. Equally, it could be creating individual pieces of code that are then knitted together by the organisation. Now, these forms of engaging with new forms of workforce models are somewhat reliant on you having access to those forms of talent, but by controlling access, allowing you to actually put controls in place around how they're contracted for, the price that you pay and the risk that you're exposing yourself to. As we say, total talent management is a journey that we are advocating most organisations to kind of review at this point in time to approach workforce engagement in a more strategic way. There are a number of lessons that we've learned along the way and observed in the external market that we would want to pass back in order for you to understand some of the controls that might be required as you embark on this journey. Kind of go back to the slide in terms of where we started. Do you understand the breakdown of your non-employee workforce, of your non-permanent workforce? And the answer for most organisations is no, they don't. There's no one single source of truth. There are a variety of different places they can go to understand that information. But invariably, when tackling this as a strategic initiative, the lack of data is inhibiting people's ability to progress this agenda. One of the key things that we would recommend that people look at is the constraint that is imposed by your current definition of headcount, by how FTE itself is engaged by the organisation itself, and start to understand some of the unwanted behaviours that drives within the organisation itself. We absolutely advocate as step 2 that organisations look to impose a level of control around the way that non-employee resources are onboarded into the organisation in order to place more immediate risk controls around the information, and that might be kind of logical access to systems and client data, or to buildings, either through security controls that the non-employee workforce has access to. We've seen now time and time again that organisations who implement step 2 successfully have been able to then use the data that this has provided to step back and analyse the scale of the challenge that they face, and how many individuals they're dealing with, what forms of talent are being onboarded, what categories of spend they sit within, and as a result, they're then able to understand how to categorise that spend, how to apply a more strategic approach to procuring that category of spend, but to do that within a holistic framework that avoids unforeseen or unwanted circumstances where controls are not universally applied across all forms of workforce engagement. Now, clearly there are a variety of different ways that you can then subsequently address those challenges. One way would be to look at outsourced service providers, to look at how total talent management services could deliver benefit to you, or how managed service programs could extend into statement of work or services controls. But equally, we've seen trends around the world of organisations tackling this internally and building centralised teams to govern not only the on- and offboarding of resources, but also centralised procurement across a range of different functions. There are, however, many organisations who haven't actually tackled some of the historic constructs, and for whom the engagement of temps and contractors or the contingent workforce is still relatively uncontrolled. So I'm going to pass back to Jeff just to talk about some of the best practice in that arena in terms of addressing cost, risk and quality controls across that population.
Thanks, John. So let's look at the UK contingent workforce models that are out there, and perhaps what does your organisation currently look like? You can see we have 4 boxes there, which moves from a decentralised, no control, moving through to preferred suppliers with some light SLAs in place, through to MSPs, and then finally to an enterprise workforce solution. And I think it's very easy to argue that with the potential changes running through or happening in under IR35, and also the increasing need to wrap in all forms of non-contingent workforce, that having an enterprise workforce solution does make a lot more sense than it perhaps once did. But to step back a frame across those 4 boxes, I think it still surprises both John and I to this day the number of organisations who are still who have a significant non-perm workforce, who are still in fact in buckets 1 and 2. And I think ultimately for us, offering RPO and MSP services, we often see that many organisations, there is a strong focus on perm, and if perm hiring is not working well, or attrition is too high, it sits directly with the HR director. And I think quite commonly we see in organisations who don't have a strong procurement presence, that the non-perm workforce isn't often looked at, and we would often argue that the bigger gains in terms of cost and certainly the potential exposure to risk is far higher in that area, and it's something that we always feel that procurement needs to lead, because frankly, if they don't, nobody else does. So if you don't have an MSP, why should you adopt an MSP? And being candid, this is the main slide we share with our customers in most cases. And we typically find that our clients will adopt an MSP for all of these three broad reasons. And it's for us to understand the mix of the desires within there. We often still have customers saying to us, we don't know how many temps or statement of work consultants we have in the business, and that's still very, very common. We often have customers say to us, they're looking to derive a cost save, and often the initial thought is around agency margin, and then we often talk about the many forms of different ways of actually of benefiting significant cost save in that process. And then thirdly, and certainly not finally, is broadly around risk, which I think probably, as John and I have both alluded to, we're seeing that being the main driver over the last 3 years, particularly when we're looking at complex organisations, complex way of hiring, multi-country customers, and I think this has become even more of a catalyst with the potential IR35 move into private sector, and it may actually be perhaps one of the reasons to get a program off the ground. I think it will be a strong reason why you will find stakeholder engagement internally will be stronger because of those sorts of risks. I think all of these three things can't be done without technology underpinning, obviously, a VMS, as many of you have experienced. So how do you start to control your non-perm workforce? Well, there's three main recommendations from us. I think the two things that need to be done is centralising and tracking activity. So how do we get this started? Well, point one, you need to know your numbers. Get as much of your data as you can in one place. Evaluate your current usage and spend. If you don't know the answers to these questions, it's probably time you look at a centralised system, a VMS, to track the key performance indicators and automate processes. But don't focus just on those vendor markups for cost savings. These will come with a well-managed process. Again, experts such as those who monitor market rates or offer workforce management systems will be able to advise on benchmarks, what you should be measuring, and the best way to do it. Point two, assess where your biggest risks and inefficiencies are coming from, and what processes and contracts are in place that are driving those behaviours. If you face multiple processes for different departments, business units and locations, sharing best practice and demonstrating the positive impact this has had can be a good place to start. Centralising and simplifying the process will prevent hiring from spiralling out of control. Key to this will be managing change. So don't be afraid to ask for expert advice. For example, you can call an outsourcing supplier and ask a lot of questions to understand what they offer and what might solve the specific problems you're facing. Typically, you find clients engaging with a number of suppliers in assessing what they should be doing. This allows varied opinion and the ability to make sure you come up with the right solutions for your particular business. Third and finally, put all the insight and best practice to work. Automate where you can, such as billing and payment processes, or releasing vacancies to vendors, and review your suppliers and renegotiate your rate cards.
Thanks, Jeff. So just as the final section and before we move into Q&A, I wanted just to take some time with you just to share, I guess, one of the experiences one of our own customers has had in going down a total talent management kind of journey, and how their more strategic approach to engaging or to procuring for services around temps and contractors and permanent staff has delivered benefit back into the organisation, kind of above and beyond what they initially expected around cost controls and risk controls. So for those of you who aren't aware, Computer Centre are a $4 billion turnover infrastructure provider. And actually they were amongst the first in their sector to take a strategic approach to joining up their procurement of perm services under an RPO contract and the MSP services for their temps and contractors all under Hays as a single vendor. So not only did that provide them with an efficiency in the way that we kind of applied charges, because we had better utilisation and a more efficient or effective team assigned across the organisation, but it actually meant for the first time ever that they had one team looking at their needs regardless of the type of work required. And this in itself has driven out a number of different benefits. And actually it's these benefits that we're seeing a lot of organisations now trying to access when they go down total talent management as a path. As a result of having a more holistic viewpoint into Computer Centre's needs, we've been able to look at, from a strategic workforce planning perspective, their demands across all forms of talent, whether it be temps, contractors, or permanent hires. And that's delivered some benefit in a number of different ways. So let's just look at two of the use cases. Computer Centre support a number of organisations with first-line analyst desks, and then also have services where they send engineers into the field, into client organisations to address issues that have been raised. Now they hire into both of those populations on both a contract and a permanent basis. And historically, a siloed view would have seen them engaging with separate providers, building pipelines of candidates to hire on a temp basis, finding candidates to hire on a permanent basis, and not necessarily leveraging the benefit of having one provider looking at both. What we've been able to do, though, as a more strategic provider, is step back and look at the way they engage their workforce, the patterns and trends around the workforce demands, linked to things like new sales or customers going live, or just seasonal peaks and troughs, or things like regular upgrades that they're delivering to their customers. As a result, we now effectively run the resource management function within Computer Centre and have deployed a number of different specialist technology platforms that help us meet the demands, whether they be temp or perm, through engaging with external talent in one single consolidated way that helps us now bring workers on to temp contracts, evaluate them through the methods used to hire permanent members of the team, and then migrate staff from temp to perm on a periodic basis in order to reduce their needs to engage with both forms of talent independently. This in itself reduces their costs and maximises the efficiency of taking a kind of more holistic view on how to meet their skill sets and needs. But as a result of being more holistic, we've been able to take a slightly different view again and start to look at how we also manage the demand for workers across the UK and redeploy workers into roles without needs to go to the external market, maximising the IP and training that they've invested in their temp workers and redeploying those workers across a range of sites, thereby reducing their overall costs. One of the keys to success in Computer Centre has been a kind of tripartite relationship internally between HR, procurement and operations, who have since 2009 sat side by side at the heart of their organisation, driving, if you like, the need and the demand out to Hays as their outsourcing vendor around what their needs looks like and how to engage with all forms of talent in a more holistic way. So not only were they able to benefit from driving down their agency costs through implementing things like direct sourcing programs into Computer Centre that drove down their agency margin on temps and contractors placed, they were able to reduce the number of perm hires they were bringing into the organisation, which reduced their direct costs for perm placement fees, and they've been able to benefit from a combined management team which drove an efficiency in the overall on-cost of the service they purchased from Hays. And so from a number of different perspectives, they've driven out value around the cost of engaging with their workforce, and we have holistically been able to apply singular risk controls right across all forms of workforce engagement to drive down the risk profile into Computer Centre 2. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass back to Helen just to raise any questions that may have come off everybody on the webinar itself.
Thank you, John and Jeff, for sharing your insights with us. That was a really good presentation. So we'll move to the first question. The 2020 vision makes sense, but are you seeing any organisations making good progress towards SOW in their MSP programmes? Okay,
thanks, Helen. Yeah, the simple answer is yes, and a number of companies are approaching this in different ways. As we covered earlier in the slide, where we've seen success, organisations have been able to gain full visibility of their non-employee workforce in order to exercise a degree of control. That we've seen many organisations that have challenges in that they just don't know how many third-party freelancers or consultants that they have within the organisation itself, and for many of those organisations, gaining visibility and control has been a necessary first step. As what we've then seen for organisations actually bringing SOW into their MSP programs, whether they're run externally or internally, have been varying degrees of success depending on how they've started. And what we tend to see is that many organisations will initially bring time and materials, SOW engagement under control through the consolidated program first. They'll then start to kind of move up the value chain or in terms of level of complexity by looking at more milestone-based projects. And I guess at the moment, the end game for most organisations seems to be a position where their temps and their contractors and then their outsourced services in the form of time and materials, deliverables or assets are actually under control of the program itself. One of the challenges that doesn't address has been a concern that they're overpaying for skills at the consulting end of the scale, and very often a reluctance to look at consulting spend and look at ways of reducing the total cost of engaging with resources to deliver those projects. But that's something we will see an appetite for, I think, increasingly over the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you for that. Moving to the next question. With the rise of RPA automation reducing headcount, what are the key things the organisation needs to do to keep total management strategy A, current, and B, in line with its technology strategy?
Great question. Okay, right, where to begin? So I've seen very few, if I'm honest, I've seen very few organisations really tackling this one strategically. Those that have, and actually a couple of organisations in Australia that we were working with earlier in the year have really tackled this head on because their strategy is based on reducing their fixed costs, whether they be fixed people cost or fixed property costs, through automating some of their business processes in order that they can deliver greater efficiency and better service to their clients. The HR function that we were dealing with basically realised that unless they were operating a truly strategic workforce plan that took into account all aspects of their strategy and not just people-related aspects, that they would fundamentally not be able to deliver the total talent management journey itself. So we saw that organisation implement a strategic workforce planning team within its HR function, which had representatives from procurement as part of the steering committee. they then stepped back and reviewed the strategy of the organisation to look at all factors that were driving resource engagement requirements over the next 24 to 36 months. And that in itself is unusual because many organisations that we have exposure to, their outlook on skills engagement is at best a 12-month outlook, even if their stated strategy is out over maybe a 3 to 5 year outlook. But where I've seen this work, we've actually seen a very conscious approach to remodelling the workforce needs based on process automation projects so that the talent acquisition and HR functions and procurement are aware of what the demands will be on their functions over the next 12 to 24 months. And that in itself is guiding their actions and activities around driving this total talent management agenda, because ultimately what that means is that process automation and robotics becomes another factor in the strategic workforce plan that impacts the shape and size and composition and location of the workforce demands moving forward, and that in itself allows an organisation to have a strategy about how they deliver that plan with a scenario planning exercise that drives full awareness of the factors that will impact their needs over the next 12 to 24 months. Like I say, it's a really great question. I've only seen a couple of organisations tackling this, I think, kind of head on, but the key to that has always been the presence of a truly strategic workforce plan that's been guiding activities.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, what is Hays doing to manage the risk of I-35 for new clients of new contractors that may be impacted by the rules being rolled out into the private sector?
I'll take that one, Helen. I think interesting, we had a webinar last week which had over 600 people on it, so there's obviously quite a lot of interest in the subject, and we're trying to give our customers early warning around what they can expect. We had a call last week where we had our global head of tax and treasury on the call, and also our UK head of public sector engagement, who went through the entire IR35 change earlier in the year within public sector, and gave a view of what we saw the trends were there, and perhaps some of the reactions to that we could predict if and when it occurs in the private sector. I think one of the things that we did see initially was that certainly in the public sector it was very it was released quite early. There wasn't a big lead or a lead time or roll into it. So I think a number of organisations were taken by surprise and perhaps were slightly overly cautious. And initially there was in some organisations, right, let's stop hiring interims. And I think in the 6 months subsequent to that, we've seen most organisations reverse the trend and really onboard people in a different way, and they're buying in a different way. I think just in terms of advice to the private sector, again, I think it's firstly it's having visibility to start off with, and I think it's perhaps one around the earlier points around a decentralised non-contingent workforce solution. If you don't know what's in your business, well, there's a significant risk. So I think it's it's understanding that risk to start off with, and that's point one. I think point two is perhaps already starting to change how you consider hiring temps. A lot of organisations have hired temps on an ongoing basis, as opposed to hiring a service that delivers outputs, and I think that should be a shift. And I think the third point, and coming back to the MSP point, is perhaps the IR35 piece being a catalyst. I think it very much does say to people, well, get someone else to look at it for you. And I think there, as I say, there would be the 3 points that I would recommend.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, have you got any case studies where organisations or outsourcing manage the total talent solution, consultancy and resource?
Yeah, what I'll do is, just for reasons of client confidentiality, that's something that I'm happy to pick up outside of this call. If whoever raised the question wants to contact Helen directly, I'm more than happy to go into those details. To suffice to say, I've only seen a couple of organisations that have truly tackled the consulting spend. The view I get from a lot of HR, talent acquisition and procurement professionals is it's a highly political space. A lot of the stakeholders that they're dealing with internally are kind of very senior, and a lot of organisations have yet to really have a full appetite for tackling that, especially when they see that there are a number of kind of low-hanging fruits that sit around the misclassified temporary contract workers engaged under T&M SOW, but at vastly inflated rates that they see delivering significant cost benefit with perhaps less political capital expended. But very, very happy to try and pick that one up offline and put more detail to that.
Okay. Thank you very much. So whoever raised that question, if you want to email me at helen.older@cips.org and I can pass it on. Another question, our P2P system does not have the capability to give us granular data we need, particularly on consultancy. We have quite a large tail. How have the other organisations gotten around this to get the visibility they need, particularly if on tight budgets?
Yeah. So, okay, so yeah, really good question, because most organisations, well, most procurement organisations are operating under really tight budgets, and it depends on the visibility that we seek. What we often find is that if you don't understand how many resources are engaged and via which providers, that it's then very difficult to drill down on conversations with specific providers, for example, about the cost profile or rate cards that they might have deployed. But most organisations, certainly those in the regulated industry sectors, will have one thing in common, and that's that you will have controls around how people access your systems and how people access your sites. So, as I say, what we've seen deliver really effective visibility and control quickly is where organisations have looked to centralise or gain visibility on the process of providing non-employees with access to your sites and systems, to logical and physical access controls. Because by doing that, you can actually see the flow, the ebb and flow of consultants into and out of the organisation. And as long as your request for access process can capture details around the organisation that they're working through, then you quite quickly have a mechanism for capturing that data. We've actually seen organisations revoke all non-employee controls in order to push everybody back through the control processes to deliver immediate visibility. Other organisations have got regular control points where access controls will be effectively removed after 3 months and need to be re-requested. So depending on your organisation, I think there are a couple of different ways that you can look to do that. I think the extreme end of the scale, revoking all access and pushing everyone back through those functions may not make you popular. It certainly drives immediate visibility, but obviously it needs to be done in full knowledge of what you're trying to achieve. Even just putting a control process in today around recording all requests for new non-employee access with the addition of which consulting provider or service provider they're being supplied by can give you quite quick visibility into that tail.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we probably have time for one final question. With the risk of I-35 coming into the private sector, is there a risk of the contingent workforce decreasing and taking permanent roles instead? Are there any companies planning for this already?
I'll take that one, thank you, Helen. is a recruitment business, clearly I'd say no. No, I'm just kidding. I think in terms of that, I think there is a suspicion around that, and I think this really says to me this is why, you know, a total talent management system needs to be sitting in place, where, you know, procurement are engaged with HR and people are resourcing in the most effective manner. So again, this IR35 piece is a catalyst. I think the only evidence we've got is what happened in the public sector, and I think, you know, initially there was a ceasing of hiring as many temps, and we didn't actually see a huge influx on the permanent appointment side. And then over time, once people got used to how they needed to buy, we saw that change. So again, I think it's not thinking about it as you know, necessarily temp or perm. It's just thinking about what's the correct solution for your organisation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'd like to thank Hayes Talent Solutions today and the speakers for sharing such an informative presentation with us. Hayes will follow up directly following the presentation with information about this webinar, and you will have the opportunity to ask any further questions you didn't get a chance to ask today directly to Hayes. Also, you can contact me, and there's my email address if you want me to follow anything up or pass anything on your behalf. Okay, so thank you for all our attendees for attending today, and thanks again to the speakers. We will also have the recorded webinar on the knowledge pages in due course. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.